me a little bit about some of the change DOC has seen as a result of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative?
Sure. Yeah. So as you know, 2014, I think, legislative session, all 105 legislators voted for Justice Reinvestment, Senate Bill 1357. And, it's a pretty significant change to our system. And I guess if I had to describe it in a nutshell, it really forces the Department of Correction to become a lot more efficient as it relates to like inmates getting programs and inmates that are going to get out closer to their parole eligibility date. Whereas in the past, there were a lot of cases where inmates would go beyond their parole eligibility date, and in many cases it was because our own inefficiencies, like we didn't have them programmed when they should have been, or we had low risk offenders in high risk offender programs and those types of things that just kind of clogged up our system. And so what Justice Reinvestment did is, in our prison system anyways, forced us to look at ourselves and create some efficiencies, which we've done. I can go into more in depth with what we've done. And then on the probation and parole side of things, we've just we're essentially supervising offenders a little bit differently, and we use this thing called a response matrix, for instance. And so anytime a probationer or parolee does something positive, we should be providing something positive back to that person. They come in and give us a clean UA, we should be saying to them, hey, great job, this is awesome. And kind of that drug court model of maybe providing them a candy bar or something like that that says, hey, keep up the good work. But on the other end of it, that response matrix also talks about if they do something stupid, if they break a rule on probation or parole, commit a new crime or something like that, that matrix dictates what actions should take place with that offender. In some cases it might be like, arresting that offender. In some cases it might be, taking some privileges away from them, like no longer allowing them to, travel or something outside of the district without permission or something like that. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of those things kind of, and then there's a lot more, but I can go into it.
Inmate population, how has JRI helped reduce that?
Yeah, it definitely has helped reduce our population. So today we're flat, in our inmate population, and a lot of that has to do with that those efficiencies that I talked about. Like we've made some significant changes in how we put offenders through treatment programs. We called for in February of 2015. We asked for the Council of State Government to come back into our system. They'd spent the whole year here in 2014. We asked them to come back into our system and do a top-to-bottom review of all of our treatment programs. Are they working? Are Idahoans getting good bang for their buck? And so they completed this assessment called a Justice Program Assessment. And the findings were, first, in a positive way, they found that our staff, by and large, are very much amenable to programs and education. Like in a lot of other systems, they're not so open to that. And that was pretty much the only good news associated with their findings. The rest of the findings showed that 9 out of the 12 programs that we had didn't have evidence to say that they worked, so we couldn't prove that they were working. We had a couple programs, like our therapeutic communities, hot button issue in Idaho, considered a sacred cow in Idaho. We had several of them in our prisons. This assessment showed that an inmate with the same risk level that would have gone through a therapeutic community was recidivating at a higher rate than an inmate at the same risk level that wasn't going through one. So they were basically showing that they were not helping; they were making inmates worse. And there's also other issues associated with them. And then lastly, the findings showed that we were just inefficient. Our programs were redundant and confusing, very complex. Our pathways to parole, very complex and confusing. So, we wasted no time. September of 2015, when the assessment ended, we put an action plan together. We discontinued all use of therapeutic communities. We stopped doing the 12 programs that we were doing and started the process of transitioning to what we have today, which is 5 research-based programs. We have them universal in every one of our prisons. They're all public domain programs, which is cool because they're free to us, whereas the other programs that we were using that cost money, that this assessment showed didn't even work, that was wasting taxpayer dollars. And so we're very, very excited about the direction we're going in today. So all of that means this, that those efficiencies that have been put into place allowed for us to take what we would consider to be lower risk offenders, mostly drug crime offenders, and put them on parole. Whereas, in the past they'd be sitting at a prison at $55 a day, and we weren't sprinkling anything magical on them to make them better. So that's what created some of the efficiencies in order for us to have a somewhat declining inmate population.
With justice reinvestment, explain to me what happens if those inmates do violate their parole. They don't come directly back to the prison. What is the step?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, so those same drug offenders that we parole, here's what's maybe not known from a lot of people. They're our highest recidivists. Our drug and alcohol offenders recidivate at a higher rate than most any other inmate we have in our system, and it's because I think of the strong ties to addiction and meth and heroin and alcohol and all those types of things. So even though those offenders are getting out on parole, it's not going to shock me off my chair if we see that our recidivism numbers are actually trending up a little bit, because again, they recidivate at a higher rate. So to answer your question, in the past, before justice reinvestment, if you had an offender that a parolee that we arrested, that person would be arrested. They would sit in the county jail for upwards to 30 days, 60 days sometimes. We would move them to the Idaho State Correctional Institution. They would stay there for about 5 months in most cases. They then would go in front of a parole commission, and 65% of the time the parole commission would put them back on parole, or reinstate them back on parole. So I think what justice reinvestment did, or the Council of State Government did, is they looked at all of that and they said, my gosh, you have them in your system for 6 months or 7 months, you're doing nothing with them. You're not programming them, you're doing nothing with them. They're just sitting there waiting for the parole commission. I think that's probably where the decision came to, instead of doing that, today when that offender violates their parole, let's say they give it like a dirty UA or a couple dirty UAs or something like that, the Senate Bill 1357 says that they can do up to 90 days in jail or prison for that first offense. So that's one of our parole officers arresting that offender, putting them in jail, or in some cases they'll sit in that jail, in some cases they'll get sent to our prison, and for up to 90 days they'll sit there, and then they get put back on parole. If they do that again, so they get back on parole, they do something stupid again, they get a dirty UA, they do something to violate their parole, then it kicks it up to 120 days sanction. So basically the same thing. They're going to either sit in a jail, or in the 120 days they come to one of our prisons. And then if they come back out again and do something again, dirty UAs, those types of things, then that kicks them up to the parole commission for a decision to whether they go back to the big house or be reinstated back on parole. In those cases, I think the vast majority of them are getting sent to the big house.
How has that saved the Department of Correction money?
I think where it saved really Idahoans money is, as I mentioned before, that offender that would sit in a prison bed for 6 months, we're doing nothing with that offender. That's at $55 a day, and then they would ultimately wind up go back to the streets. We were just delaying the inevitable, and it was costing Idahoans a bunch of money. I think what we have today is it's a shorter time period where we're getting them in, holding them accountable, and then putting them back out on parole, hopefully, to be successful. But some of the things that I think that have come about through this is we've got some challenges. Canyon County is an example of that. Sheriff Donahue, I think does a very, very good job, and it matters to him, of course, about their inmate population, and with making sure that they're meeting all of regulations and codes and things like that. If a lot of those guys in District 3 are 90 and 120 day offenders, then one of the things that we work very closely with Sheriff Donahue, is try to get them out of there and put them in one of our prisons here south of town. But in some cases it's creating a challenge. In some cases it's not. One of the benefits, if you will, of doing that is we're paying for those offenders. So that offender that's sitting in the county jail, whatever county jail across the state. The state of Idaho is cutting a check to that particular county to pay for that inmate being in there.